Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Travel Stories. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey unlike any we've taken before. We're traveling to places where the very word lost carries a weight of centuries, where entire civilizations rose from the sand and, in some cases, return to it. We're exploring the oases of the Silk Road, those precious islands of green in an ocean of desert, those ancient meeting places where East truly met West, where ideas and goods and peoples mingled in ways that shape the world we know today. These aren't places you stumble upon by accident. The oases of the Silk Road exist in some of the most remote corners of Central Asia, scattered like emeralds across the vast expanses of the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts, nestled at the feet of mountains whose names alone evoke mystery. The Tian Shan, the Kunlun, the Pamirs. To reach them is to step not just across distance, but across time itself, into landscapes that have witnessed the passage of countless travelers over more than 2,000 years. I find myself standing at the edge of this journey with a mixture of anticipation and something close to reverence. These oases aren't merely geographic features or historical curiosities. They're the reason the Silk Road existed at all, the vital lifelines that made possible one of history's greatest networks of human connection. Without them, without their springs and rivers fed by distant mountain snows, without their date palms and poplar trees offering shade, without their wells dug deep into the earth by ingenious hands, the merchants and monks, the pilgrims and emissaries, the artists and scholars who traversed these routes would have perished in the unforgiving desert heat. The Silk Road itself is something of a misnomer, really. There was never a single road, never one unbroken highway stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Instead, there were routes, plural, a network of paths that branched and converged, that followed the chains of oases like beads on a string. Some routes skirted the northern rim of the fearsome Taklamakan Desert, passing through the depression of Turpan and the thriving markets of Kuka. Others traced the southern edge, linking Khotan and Yarkand and Kashgar in a line of green against the endless sand. And between these routes lay the desert itself, a place so hostile that its name in the Uyghur language means something close to "you can enter, but you cannot leave," or the place of no return. As we begin this journey together, I want you to imagine yourself arriving in this part of the world for the very first time. Perhaps you've traveled for days, weeks even, by train and bus, and eventually by four-wheel drive, watching the landscape gradually transform. the green valleys and rivers of eastern China slowly give way to grasslands, then to increasingly arid steppes, and finally to true desert, where the earth becomes every shade of brown and gold and rust, where the sky seems impossibly vast and the horizon shimmers with heat. You've read about these places, of course. You've seen photographs of blue-tiled domes and cave temples carved into cliff faces, of bazaars overflowing with melons and carpets and spices, of ancient manuscripts preserved for centuries in the dry desert air. But nothing quite prepares you for the reality of it, for the way the landscape can feel simultaneously ancient and immediate, for how the past seems to press close in these places, not as something distant and academic, but as something you can almost touch. The air here tastes different. It carries dust on the wind, yes, but also the faint sweetness of whatever might be growing in the irrigated fields. The sharp, dry heat that seems to pull moisture from your very breath. The light is particular too, clear and intense, unfiltered by the humidity that softens the air in more temperate lands. Colors appear more vivid under this light, or perhaps it's simply that color becomes more precious in a landscape dominated by the tans and browns of rock and sand. When you do encounter green, when you see the first poplar trees marking an oasis on the horizon, it feels almost miraculous, a defiant assertion of life in a place that seems to resist it. Dunhuang, the gateway to the desert. Our journey properly begins in Dunhuang, and there's a logic to starting here. For more than 1,000 years, Dunhuang has served as the gateway between China and the western regions, the place where caravans would gather their courage and make their final preparations before plunging into the desert proper. The city sits at the very edge of the Gobi Desert, where the Gansu Corridor, that narrow funnel of land between mountain ranges that channels all traffic in and out of China's northwestern frontier, finally opens onto the vastness of Central Asia. Approaching Dunhuang from the east, you travel through landscapes that tell you you're leaving the Chinese heartland behind. The Gansu Corridor is itself a kind of cultural transition zone, a place where Han Chinese culture begins to blend with Tibetan and Mongolian and Turkic influences, where Buddhist temples stand near Islamic mosques, where the faces of the people become increasingly diverse. The corridor is hemmed in by mountains to north and south, with the Great Wall running alongside the road at various points, a reminder that this has always been frontier country, a place where empires ended and began. Dunhuang itself appears almost suddenly, a splash of green in the brown landscape, fed by the waters of the Dang River, flowing down from the Kilian Mountains to the south. The modern city is small, compact, with wide streets and a mixture of old and new architecture. But the real Dunhuang, the Dunhuang that matters for our purposes, lies just beyond the city limits, in the form of the Mogao Caves. The Mogao Caves, also known as the 1,000 Buddha Caves, are carved into a cliff face rising above the Dachuan River, about 15 miles southeast of the modern city. Approaching them, you first see the cliff itself, a wall of pale brown conglomerate rock, perhaps 100 feet high, stretching for more than a mile along the river valley. And in this cliff face, like the cells of some enormous honeycomb, are the caves, hundreds of them, stacked in tiers, connected by wooden walkways and staircases that cling to the rock face. The story of how these caves came to be is one of those tales that exists somewhere between history and legend. According to tradition, in the year 366, a Buddhist monk named Lezun was traveling through this valley when he had a vision of 1,000 Buddhas bathed in golden light. Inspired by this vision, he carved the first cave temple into the cliff and lived there as a hermit. Other monks followed, and over the next 1,000 years, this site grew into one of the most important centers of Buddhist art and worship along the Silk Road. To enter the Mogao Caves is to step into a world frozen in time, though frozen is perhaps the wrong word, suggesting something cold and lifeless, when in fact these caves pulse with color and devotion and artistic achievement. The caves vary tremendously in size and age, from small meditation cells that might accommodate only a single person in a kneeling position, to vast temple halls with soaring ceilings and walls covered entirely in murals that seem to shimmer in the dim light. The darkness inside the caves is carefully maintained now to protect the ancient pigments from fading, so visitors move through them with flashlights, the beams catching fragments of the whole, a dancing apsara, her ribbons flowing in an eternal wind, a procession of merchants and their heavily laden camels, a seated Buddha, serene and golden, intricate geometric patterns that seem to shift and move in the moving light. Scenes from the Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, rendered with a narrative clarity that makes them readable even to those who don't know the stories by heart. What strikes you most, perhaps, is the sheer density of artistic effort, the way every available surface has been covered with paint or carving, or both. The ceilings are coffered with painted panels, each one different, each one containing its own tiny universe of imagery. The walls flow with continuous narratives, and if you look closely, you can see how different hands worked on different sections, how styles shift from the more Indian-influenced work of the earlier periods to the more distinctly Chinese style that emerged under the Tang dynasty, when Dunhuang was at the height of its prosperity and influence. Cave 323, for instance, contains one of the oldest known depictions of cultural exchange along the Silk Road, a mural from the Sui dynasty showing a camel pulling a cart, the kind of scene that would have been utterly commonplace in Dunhuang streets, but which now serves as a precious window into how goods and people actually moved along these routes. In other caves, you find landscapes and maps, like the famous painting in Cave 61, showing Mount Wutai with all its temples and roads and cities rendered in meticulous detail, an early form of cartography that reminds you that the monks and artists who created these works weren't just concerned with the spiritual realm, but with documenting and understanding the physical world as well. And then there's the famous Library Cave, Cave 17, discovered in 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had appointed himself guardian of the site. Inside this small cave, which had been sealed up sometime in the early 11th century for reasons that remain mysterious, Wang found nearly 50,000 manuscripts, paintings on silk, embroideries, and other items dating from the 4th to the 11th centuries. The discovery of this library, which included texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, Uyghur, and even Hebrew, was one of the great archaeological finds of the 20th century, though much of the collection ended up scattered across museums in Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, taken by the explorers and archaeologists who arrived in Dunhuang in the early 1900s. But standing in Dunhuang, in the caves themselves, what overwhelms you isn't the tragedy of dispersed collections or the complex history of archaeological excavation. What overwhelms you is the sense of devotion that built this place, the countless hours of labor undertaken in the belief that creating beautiful things in honor of the Buddha was itself a form of spiritual practice. Every stroke of pigment, every chisel mark in the rock represents an act of faith, an offering made by people whose names are largely lost to history, but whose work survives, speaking across centuries. Outside the caves, The landscape of Dunhuang continues to astonish. Just beyond the oasis, the desert begins in earnest, and the Mingsha Shan, the singing sand dunes, rise like frozen waves against the sky, reaching heights of more than 800 feet. The sand here is fine and pale gold, and when the wind blows across the dunes, or when you slide down their steep faces, the sand makes a low humming sound, a phenomenon that has been noted by travelers for thousands of years and which gives the dunes their name. At the foot of the Mingsha Shan sits Crescent Lake, a small spring-fed body of water shaped, as the name suggests, like a crescent moon. The lake is impossibly blue against the sand, impossibly green along its edges where vegetation clings to life. For centuries, it was believed the lake had no bottom, that it was somehow connected to underground rivers running all the way to the distant ocean. In reality, it's fed by the water table beneath the sand, and its depth fluctuates with the seasons and years, sometimes shrinking to worrying levels before recovering. But standing on the viewing pavilion that overlooks it, watching the light change on the water, while the wind shifts the sand into ever-changing patterns on the dunes above, you understand why this place has inspired so many poems, so many paintings, so many moments of quiet contemplation. Dunhuang's climate is harsh, extreme in a way that takes adjustment if you're not used to desert living. Summers are furnace hot, with temperatures regularly exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun beats down with an intensity that seems to vibrate in the air. Winters are bitter, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, and the wind that funnels through the valley can cut right through you. Spring brings dust storms that can reduce visibility to nearly zero and cover everything in a fine layer of grit. And yet people have lived here continuously for more than 2,000 years, finding ways to coax water from the earth, to grow wheat and millet and vegetables in irrigated fields, to build communities that could serve the constant flow of travelers passing through. The night sky in Dunhuang is something special, so far from major cities that light pollution barely exists. The Milky Way arches overhead like a river of stars, and you can understand why astronomers were drawn to this region, why the ancient Chinese built observation towers to track the movements of planets and comets. The silence of the desert night is profound, broken only by the occasional sound of wind or the distant barking of dogs from the farms on the oasis edges. It's the kind of silence that allows your thoughts to expand, to wander, the kind of silence that makes you understand why monks sought out this landscape for meditation and prayer. Turpan. Life in the depression. From Dunhuang, the journey continues westward, deeper into the Taklamakan region. The route takes you through increasingly arid landscape, past salt flats and gravel plains, past the distant shapes of mountains that seem to hover between earth and sky. After several hours of travel, the road descends, quite literally descends, dropping below sea level into one of the lowest spots on the Earth's surface, the Turpan Depression. Turpan sits at 505 feet below sea level, the second lowest continental depression in the world after the Dead Sea. The descent into the depression is gradual enough that you might not notice it at first. But then you pass the marker on the roadside, telling you you're now at sea level and then below it, and the landscape takes on an otherworldly quality. The heat here is legendary. The depression traps hot air like a bowl, and summer temperatures can reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit, with the ground temperature even higher. The locals have a saying about Turpan's heat. It's so hot that you can cook eggs by burying them in the sand. And yet, Turpan is an oasis, and a remarkably productive one. The secret lies underground in one of the most ingenious water management systems ever devised, the Carrez wells. The Carrez system consists of underground channels, sometimes running for tens of miles, that bring water from the snowmelt of the Tian Shan Mountains to the north, down to the fields and gardens of the oasis. The water flows entirely underground, preventing evaporation in the brutal heat, and vertical shafts at regular intervals allow access for maintenance and repair. The Carrez system was likely introduced to Turpan from Persia, where similar systems called qanats had been used for thousands of years. But the people of Turpan perfected it, adapting it to their specific geography and needs. At the height of the system's use, there were more than 1,000 individual Carrez channels around Turpan, with a total length of more than 3,000 miles of underground waterways. Many are still in use today, though others have fallen into disrepair as modern wells and pumps have made them less essential. You can visit some of the Carrez channels, descending into the cool darkness of the underground passages where the water flows clean and clear over ancient stone. The temperature drops immediately as you enter, a blessed relief from the surface heat. The walls are faced with stone and brick, and you can see the marks of the tools that dug these passages, the centuries of maintenance work that kept them flowing. The water moves swiftly, but not violently, murmuring over the channel bed. And you can understand why the Carrez is often described as the lifeline of Turpan. the reason this desert depression could support agriculture and substantial populations. The water from the Karas feeds into a network of irrigation channels that divide and subdivide, bringing water to fields of wheat and cotton, to orchards of apricots and peaches, and most famously, to the vineyards. Turpan is known throughout China for its grapes, particularly the seedless white grapes that grow in abundance in the local climate. The grapes are dried into raisins in distinctive drying houses, mud brick structures with ventilation holes that allow air to circulate while keeping out direct sunlight. Walking through the outskirts of Turpan, you see these drying houses everywhere, and the smell of drying fruit is sweet on the air, mingling with the dust and the heat. But it's the ruins that draw most visitors to Turpan, the evidence of the ancient civilizations that flourished here long before the modern city. The Jiaohe ruins lie about 6 miles west of modern Turpan, built on an elevated plateau between 2 rivers whose names mean Willow River in the local Uyghur language. The plateau is shaped like a leaf, narrow at both ends and wider in the middle, about 1 mile long and perhaps 1/4 mile across at its widest point. Jiaohe was once one of the great cities of the Silk Road, serving as the capital of the Kingdom of Cheshi, one of the 36 kingdoms of the Western regions mentioned in ancient Chinese historical records. The city's location was naturally defensive, with steep cliffs dropping away on all sides to the rivers below, requiring no walls for protection. This natural fortress helped Jiaohe survive for more than 2,000 years, from its founding around the 2nd century before the Common Era until its final abandonment in the 14th century. Walking through Jiaohe today, you're struck by how well preserved it is, despite the passage of so many centuries. This is the blessing of the desert climate. The lack of rainfall means the mud brick structures don't melt away, and the dry air preserves organic materials that would rot in more humid climates. The entire city is built from rammed earth, carved down from the plateau itself, rather than built up with added material. The technique gives the ruins a strange, flowing quality, as if they've been sculpted from the land rather than constructed upon it. The main street of Jiaohe runs down the center of the plateau, wide and straight, with residential areas branching off to either side. The houses are small, typically just 1 or 2 rooms, with thick walls that would have provided some insulation against the extreme temperatures. You can still make out the division between residential and administrative areas, between Buddhist temples and government buildings. In some places, you can see the remains of storage rooms and workshops, the infrastructure of daily life in an ancient city. The Buddhist temple complex at Jiaohe is particularly striking, with the remains of a large stupa at its center and smaller structures arranged around it. The stupa would have been covered in elaborate decorations and paintings once, though only traces remain now. But standing in this sacred space, you can imagine the smell of incense, the sound of chanting, the quiet rustle of silk robes as monks went about their daily rituals. What happened to Jiaohe? Why was it eventually abandoned? The answer is complex, involving shifting political powers, changing trade routes, and the gradual drying of the climate that made water increasingly scarce. By the 14th century, the rivers that had sustained the city for so long were drying up, and the population gradually moved away, leaving the city to the silence of the desert. Not far from Jiaohe, the flaming mountains rise like a wall of fire from the desert floor. These mountains get their name from their color, a deep red that seems to glow in the intense sunlight, and from the heat that radiates from their surface. In summer, surface temperatures on the flaming mountains can reach 160 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that you literally cannot touch the rock with your bare hands. The mountains are completely barren, devoid of vegetation, just layer upon layer of red sandstone carved into fantastic shapes by wind and rare rains. The Flaming Mountains are famous in Chinese literature as the setting for a key episode in Journey to the West, one of the great classical novels. In the story, the monk Xuanzang and his companions must cross the Flaming Mountains on their pilgrimage to India, but the heat is so intense it threatens to consume them. Eventually, with the help of Princess Iron Fan and her magical fan, they manage to create a passageway through the flames. The story is pure fantasy, of course, but it's rooted in the very real challenge these mountains presented to travelers, the very real heat that made this landscape so hostile. At the base of the Flaming Mountains, carved into the cliff face, are the Bezeklik 1,000 Buddha caves, another complex of Buddhist cave temples dating from the 6th to the 14th centuries. The caves here were once as richly decorated as those at Mogao, with brilliant murals showing Buddhist legends, portraits of donors and nobles, and scenes from daily life along the Silk Road. Unfortunately, many of the murals were damaged or destroyed over the centuries, first by Islamic iconoclasts who considered the images of Buddha to be idolatrous, and later by German archaeologists Albert von Lecoq, who cut entire sections of murals from the walls and shipped them back to Berlin, where most were destroyed during World War II. What remains at Bezeklik is still impressive, particularly the murals showing the multi-ethnic nature of Silk Road society. You see figures with clearly Chinese features alongside others who appear Persian or Indian or Central Asian, all participating in the same religious ceremonies, all part of the same cosmopolitan world. The murals also show details of clothing, jewelry, musical instruments, and architecture that provide invaluable insights into how people actually lived during the height of the Silk Road era. Evening in Turpan brings a temporary reprieve from the heat. The temperature drops, though it remains warm, and the sky takes on extraordinary colors, deep purples and oranges and reds that seem to echo the colors of the flaming mountains. The modern city comes to life as the heat of the day fades, with people emerging to walk in the parks, to eat at outdoor restaurants, to conduct business at the night market. The Uyghur culture is strong here, visible in the language you hear on the streets, in the architecture of the old quarter, in the food sold at market stalls, hand-pulled noodles, lamb kebabs, flatbreads baked in clay ovens, the sweet yellow melons that are a local specialty. The grape arbors that cover many of the streets provide shade during the day and become gathering places in the evening. People sit beneath them drinking tea, playing cards, watching children play. There's a graciousness to the social life here, a slower pace that seems fitting for a place where the heat demands a certain deliberateness in how you move through the day. You learn quickly that fighting the desert is futile. Instead, you adapt to it. You work with its rhythms rather than against them. Kashgar, where worlds converge. The journey from Turpan to Kashgar takes you deeper into Xinjiang, skirting the northern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. It's a long journey, best broken into stages, and the landscape changes as you travel westward. The mountains draw closer. The Tian Shan range to the north, becoming more dramatic, with snow-capped peaks visible even in summer. The oasis towns become smaller and more scattered, separated by longer stretches of desert and semi-desert. Kashgar sits at the far western edge of China, so close to the borders with Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan that it feels more Central Asian than Chinese. A city where the influences of many cultures have blended into something unique. Geographically, Kashgar is closer to Istanbul or Cairo than it is to Beijing, and this isolation from the Chinese heartland combined with its position at the junction of major trade routes, has made it one of the most cosmopolitan cities in history. The approach to Kashgar takes you through increasingly mountainous terrain, with the Pamirs rising to the south, their peaks touching 25,000 feet and more. These are serious mountains, barriers that shaped the flow of trade and culture for millennia. The passes through the Pamirs are high and treacherous, but they are also the gateways to the rest of Central Asia, to the valleys of the Amu Darya and the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara beyond. Modern Kashgar is a city of contrasts, with gleaming new buildings standing alongside ancient structures, with wide boulevards cutting through old quarters where the streets are barely wide enough for a donkey cart. The Chinese government has undertaken extensive modernization of the city in recent years, a process that has been controversial, with critics arguing that it amounts to the destruction of Uyghur cultural heritage. Parts of the old city have been demolished and rebuilt, sometimes with a kind of theme park aesthetic that tries to evoke the past, while actually replacing it with something new. But the heart of Kashgar, its soul, still beats in its markets, particularly the Sunday market, or more accurately, the Sunday Bazaar, which has been held weekly for more than 2,000 years. The market is enormous, sprawling across several city blocks, divided into sections for different types of goods. There's the livestock section on the outskirts of town, where farmers and herders bring sheep and goats and cattle and horses to sell or trade, a scene of organized chaos with thousands of animals and hundreds of buyers conducting business in rapid-fire Uyghur or Mandarin or Russian. Moving into the covered sections of the bazaar, you find everything imaginable. Carpets from Khotan, hanging in brilliant reds and blues and golds. Jade from the rivers at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains, carved into jewelry and sculptures and ornaments. Spices piled in pyramids of color, saffron and cumin and dried chili peppers, silk scarves and cotton fabrics, leather goods, musical instruments, the long-necked dutar and the two-stringed tambour, baskets and pottery, traditional Uyghur hats, the dopper, each one embroidered with intricate geometric patterns, knives with curved blades and carved handles, and food, endless varieties of food, fresh fruits and vegetables from the surrounding oasis, enormous watermelons and honeydew melons, grapes and apricots and pomegranates, fresh naan bread, hot from the tandoor ovens, lamb kebabs sizzling over charcoal, samsa pastries filled with meat and onions. The sensory experience of the bazaar is overwhelming in the best possible way, The colors are impossibly vivid against the dust and sun. The voices of vendors calling out in multiple languages create a constant background hum. The smells shift from section to section, from the earthy smell of livestock to the sweet smell of fruit, to the savory smell of cooking meat, to the complex aromatic smell of spices. And everywhere, the constant negotiation, the ritual of bargaining that turns every transaction into a social interaction, a performance where both sides know their roles and play them with practiced ease. Walking through the old quarter of Kashgar, what remains of it, you get a sense of what the city must have been like in its heyday. The houses are built in traditional Uyghur style, with thick walls and small windows to keep out the heat, with courtyards at their centers where families gather, where grapevines provide shade and fountains provide coolness. The streets are narrow and winding, deliberately so, creating shade and channeling what breezes might exist. In some areas, the houses are connected by wooden balconies and covered walkways at the second-story level, creating a kind of aerial network above the street. The Eid-Ka Mosque stands at the center of the old city, the largest mosque in China, capable of holding more than 20,000 worshippers. The mosque's history stretches back to the 15th century, though it has been rebuilt and expanded many times since then. The entrance is marked by a tall gateway faced in yellow tiles, leading to a large courtyard surrounded by arcades. The prayer hall itself is vast, supported by dozens of wooden pillars, with a ceiling painted in traditional Islamic geometric patterns. The atmosphere inside is one of calm and contemplation, a refuge from the noise and heat of the city outside. Islam came to this region in the 8th century, gradually replacing the Buddhism that had previously dominated. The transition wasn't always peaceful, and much of the Buddhist heritage of the area was destroyed in the process. But Islam put down deep roots here, becoming integral to Uyghur identity and culture. The call to prayer that echoes across Kashgar 5 times a day is as much a part of the city's soundscape as the honking of car horns or the rattle of bicycle bells. The blending of cultures in Kashgar creates fascinating juxtapositions. You'll see women wearing traditional headscarves, shopping for clothes in modern boutiques, men in traditional embroidered caps using smartphones, Buddhist motifs incorporated into Islamic architecture, Chinese characters alongside Arabic script on shop signs. The city's population includes Uyghurs, Han Chinese, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, and others, And while tensions exist, there's also a pragmatic acceptance of diversity born from centuries of coexistence. Food in Kashgar reflects these multiple influences. The polo, or pilaf, is Central Asian in origin. Rice cooked with lamb and carrots and onions, seasoned with cumin and black pepper. The lakman noodles are hand-pulled in the Chinese style, but served with a spicy sauce that shows Indian influence. The yogurt is thick and tangy, served with honey or sugar, a staple of pastoral nomadic diets. The naan bread comes in dozens of varieties, some plain, some topped with sesame seeds or nigella seeds, some shaped into rings, others into thick rounds. The kebabs are always lamb, never pork, following Islamic dietary laws, grilled over wood charcoal until the fat drips and sizzles and the meat takes on a smoky char. The craft traditions of Kashgar are remarkable, maintained by families who have practiced the same skills for generations. The knife makers work with hammered steel, creating blades that balance beauty and functionality, with handles made from bone or wood or horn, decorated with traditional patterns. The carpet weavers work on large looms, their fingers flying as they tie thousands of individual knots to create the intricate patterns passed down through centuries, each region having its own distinctive style and color palette. The musical instrument makers carve the long necks of the dutars and rebabs from mulberry wood, carefully calculating the proportions that will produce the desired tone. Stretching animal skin over the resonating chambers, inlaying decorative patterns in mother of pearl or colored wood. Night falls over Kashgar with surprising swiftness, the sun dropping behind the Pamirs and the light fading from the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. The evening air cools and people emerge to walk, to gather in tea houses, to sit outside their homes and talk with neighbors. The lit courtyards visible through open gates show glimpses of private life. Families eating dinner together, children doing homework, old men playing chess. There's a timeless quality to these scenes. Even though satellite dishes sprout from rooftops and electric lights have replaced oil lamps, the mountains around Kashgar hold their snow year-round on the highest peaks, a visible reminder of where the water comes from that makes this oasis possible. The rivers flowing down from those peaks, the Kashgar River and its tributaries, bring cold, clear water that's distributed through an ancient network of irrigation channels. The water is precious, managed carefully, allocated by traditional authorities, according to systems worked out over centuries. Everyone gets their allotted time for irrigation, their share of the flow, and the system mostly works, though conflicts can arise in dry years when the snowmelt is less than usual. Samarkand, the Pearl of Central Asia. Leaving Kashgar, the journey continues westward, crossing the high passes of the Pamirs into Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, descending eventually into the lower elevations of the Fergana Valley and beyond into Uzbekistan. This is a journey that takes days, that crosses some of the most spectacular mountain scenery on Earth. But eventually, if you keep following the old routes, you arrive in Samarkand. Samarkand sits in the Zarafshan River Valley in northeastern Uzbekistan at an elevation of about 2,000 feet, considerably lower than the high plateaus and passes you've crossed to get here. The climate is more moderate, though still continental, with hot summers and cold winters. The river valley is fertile, green with irrigated fields and orchards, and the city itself has a quality of abundance that contrasts sharply with the desert landscapes farther east. The history of Samarkand stretches back perhaps 3,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Central Asia. It has been conquered and reconquered by empires, from the Persians and Greeks to the Arabs and Mongols and finally the Russians. And each conquest has left its mark on the city's culture and architecture. But it was under the Timurids, particularly under Timur himself, known in the West as Tamerlane, that Samarkand achieved its greatest glory. Timur made Samarkand his capital in the 1400s, and he poured enormous resources into making it the most magnificent city in the world. He brought back skilled craftsmen from his conquests in Persia and India, and he set them to work building mosques and madrasas and mausoleums that would demonstrate both his power and his devotion to Islam. The result is a city where nearly every major building is a masterpiece of Islamic architecture, where turquoise tiled domes gleam against the blue sky, where carved stone and brick create patterns of astonishing complexity and beauty. The Registan, the central square of Samarkand, is arguably the most spectacular urban space in Central Asia. The word Registan means sandy place in Persian, suggesting that this area was once outside the city walls, but it has served as the heart of Samarkand for centuries. 3 massive madrasas, religious schools, surround the square on 3 sides. their facades rising 50 feet or more, covered entirely in glazed tiles in shades of blue and green and gold. The Ulugh Beg Madrasa, built in the 1420s, is the oldest of the three. Ulugh Beg was Timur's grandson, a scholar and astronomer more interested in science than in conquest, and his madrasa was one of the finest educational institutions in the Islamic world, attracting students from across Central Asia. The facade is covered in intricate tilework, showing geometric patterns and calligraphy, Quranic verses rendered in elegant Kufic script. The entrance portal, the Pishtak, is monumentally scaled, drawing the eye upward to the twin minarets that flank it. The Sherdor Madrasa, built 2 centuries later, faces the Ulugh Beg Madrasa across the square. Its facade features an unusual motif: tigers pursuing deer beneath the sun with a human face. This kind of figurative representation is technically forbidden in Islamic art, making its appearance here all the more striking. The tigers are rendered with an almost heraldic quality, stylized but vigorous, and they have become one of the iconic images of Samarkand. The third madrasa, the Tilyakori, was built in the mid-1600s, completing the ensemble of the Registan. Its name means gold-covered, and the interior of its mosque lives up to that name, with walls and ceiling covered in golden patterns that seem to glow in the filtered light from the windows. The overall effect of the Registan is one of overwhelming grandeur, tempered by exquisite detail. You can stand in the center of the square and turn slowly, taking in each facade in turn. And each time you look, you see something new, some pattern or inscription or architectural detail you hadn't noticed before. The Bibi Khanum Mosque, built between 1399 and 1404, was intended to be the largest mosque in the Islamic world, a monument to Timur's power and piety. According to legend, Timur built it in honor of his favorite wife, Bibi Khanum, though the historical record is less romantic, suggesting it was more about Timur's ego than his affection. The mosque is enormous, with a main portal that rises more than 100 feet, leading to a vast courtyard surrounded by arcades. The main prayer hall is domed, and the dome itself, covered in turquoise tiles, is visible from across the city. The construction of the Bibi Khanum was rushed, completed in just 5 years using forced labor from across Timur's empire. This haste led to structural problems, and the building began deteriorating almost immediately after its completion. Earthquakes over the centuries caused further damage, and by the 20th century, the mosque was in ruins. Extensive restoration work has been undertaken in recent decades, rebuilding much of the structure. Though some scholars argue that what stands now is more reconstruction than restoration, a modern interpretation of what the mosque might have been rather than a faithful preservation of what it was. Near the Bibi Khanum Mosque is the Siar Bazaar, the main market of Samarkand, a bustling, chaotic, wonderful space where locals come to buy their daily provisions. The market is organized by product type. One area for fresh produce, another for spices and dried goods, another for meat, another for bread. The bread section is particularly impressive, with huge rounds of naan, the traditional Uzbek flatbread, stacked in towering piles, still warm from the tandoor ovens where they're baked. The bread is always fresh, always available, and it's customary to tear off a piece and eat it warm. The simple pleasure of good bread, well made. The Shahizinda necropolis, built on a hillside northeast of the old city centre, is a complex of mausoleums dating from the 11th to the 19th centuries, though most of the surviving structures are from the 14th and 15th centuries. The name means the living king, referring to Qusam ibn Abbas, a cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, who is believed to be buried here. His tomb is the spiritual heart of the complex, a pilgrimage site that has drawn visitors for more than 1,000 years. Walking through Shahizinda is like walking through a gallery of tile work, each mausoleum decorated differently, each one demonstrating different techniques and styles, and the color palettes. Some are covered in geometric patterns, endless variations on stars and polygons that seem to shift and move as you look at them. Others feature floral motifs, stylized flowers and vines that speak to the Persian influence in Central Asian art. Still others are covered in calligraphy, verses from the Quran rendered in script so beautiful they become purely visual, appreciated for their form even by those who can't read them. The colors are extraordinary. Azure blues, ranging from pale sky blue to deep cobalt, turquoise, and teal, green like jade or emeralds, gold that catches the light, white that provides contrast and rest for the eye. The tiles themselves are made using different techniques. Some are cut from larger painted panels, creating mosaic effects. Others are molded and glazed individually, creating relief patterns. Still others combine painted and glazed techniques to create complex, multi-layered effects. Samarkand's history as a Silk Road city means it has always been ethnically and culturally diverse. The Sogdians, the ancient people who dominated this region before the Arab conquest, were renowned as merchants and middlemen, speaking multiple languages, practicing religious tolerance, serving as cultural translators between East and West. Though the Sogdians, as a distinct ethnic group, have largely disappeared, absorbed into later populations, their legacy lives on in Samarkand's cosmopolitan character. The modern city blends Uzbek and Tajik populations, with the distinction between the two often blurring, as many families have members of both ethnic groups, and the languages, while different, are mutually intelligible to some degree. Russian remains widely spoken, a legacy of Soviet rule, and English is increasingly common among younger generations. The food reflects this diversity. You'll find Uzbek plov alongside Tajik oshi palov, Russian blini alongside Central Asian manti, Georgian khachapuri alongside Turkish doner kebab. The evenings in Samarkand are lovely, particularly in the transitional seasons of spring and fall, when the temperature is moderate. The cafes and chaikhanas, the tea houses, fill with people, friends gathering to drink tea and play dominoes or cards, families out for an evening stroll. The main boulevards are tree-lined, mostly with plane trees whose broad leaves provide deep shade, and the light filtering through them in the late afternoon creates dappled patterns on the pavement. There's often music somewhere nearby, someone playing a dutar or a rhubarb, the modal melodies of Central Asian music floating on the air. The desert journey between the oases. To fully understand the oases, you must also understand what lies between them. The desert itself, the Taklamakan, whose name, whether you translate it as place of no return or place of ruins, speaks to its essential nature. The Taklamakan is vast, covering more than 130,000 square miles, making it one of the largest sandy deserts in the world. It occupies the center of the Tarim Basin, surrounded by mountains. The Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun to the south, the Pamirs to the west. The desert is not uniform. In some areas, it's composed of shifting sand dunes that can reach heights of 300 feet, towering waves of sand that move slowly but inexorably with the prevailing winds. In other areas, the surface is more gravel than sand, a flat expanse of small stones stretching to the horizon. There are salt flats where nothing grows, where the ground is encrusted with white crystals that crunch underfoot. And there are areas where ancient river channels, long since dry, create slight depressions in the landscape, places where vegetation clings to existence, fed by underground water sources. The climate of the Taklamakan is extreme in every sense. Summer temperatures can exceed 104 degrees Fahrenheit, with ground temperatures reaching even higher levels. Winter temperatures can drop to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature swing between day and night can be 40 degrees or more. Rainfall is negligible, perhaps 4 inches per year in the best watered areas, often less than an inch in the center of the desert. Dust storms are frequent and fierce, capable of reducing visibility to zero and carrying sand thousands of feet into the air, where it can travel thousands of miles, eventually settling as far away as the Pacific Ocean. Yet, the desert is not entirely lifeless. In the areas near the mountains, where seasonal streams bring water down from the snowmelt, you find stands of Euphrates poplar, Populus euphratica, one of the few tree species capable of tolerating the extreme conditions. These poplars are remarkable trees with roots that can extend more than 100 feet down in search of water, with leaves that change from narrow and willow-like in their youth to broad and rounded in maturity. In autumn, they turn brilliant gold, creating rivers of color against the brown and tan of the desert. Other plants survive here as well. Tamarisk shrubs with their feathery pink flowers, various species of sage and wormwood, aromatic even in the dry heat. Saxol, a strange shrubby tree with scale-like leaves that minimize water loss. These plants are widely spaced, each one commanding its own territory, its own water resources, creating a landscape that's spare and austere, but not entirely barren. Animal life is also present, though you have to look for it. Jerboas, small jumping rodents, are active at night when the temperature drops. Goitered gazelles, remarkably adapted to desert life, can survive without drinking water, getting all the moisture they need from the plants they eat. Wild camels, the last truly wild population of Bactrian camels in the world, roam the most remote areas, shy and difficult to spot. There are wolves and foxes, perfectly capable of thriving in this harsh environment, and birds, larks and sandgrouse, eagles and buzzards, each species finding its niche in the desert ecosystem. But for humans, the desert is unforgiving. Without water, you can survive perhaps 3 days in the summer heat, less if you're active. The sand reflects the sun's heat back at you, creating a kind of oven effect that dries you out rapidly. The wind can disorient you, erasing landmarks, making it easy to get lost, even when you think you know where you're going. And there are dangers beyond heat and thirst. Scorpions and vipers, though rare, are present, and the risk of injury far from any help is very real. This is why the oases were so crucial, why they dictated the routes that caravans took. The spacing between oases was determined by how far a loaded camel could travel in a day, usually about 20 to 30 miles. Longer gaps meant increased risk, and routes with reliable water sources were preferred even if they were longer in terms of distance because the risk was lower. The caravanserais, the rest stops built at key points along the routes, provided shelter and safety, places where travelers could rest, where animals could be watered and fed, where goods could be stored and traded. Some of these caravanserais still stand, or at least their ruins do. They're typically square or rectangular structures built of mud brick or stone, with thick walls and a single gate that could be secured at night. Inside, there's a central courtyard surrounded by rooms where travelers could sleep and store goods. In the center of the courtyard is often a well or cistern. The more elaborate caravanserais included bathhouses and mosques, recognition that travelers needed not just physical shelter, but also the comforts of civilization, the opportunity to wash and pray and interact with others. Traveling between oases even today, with modern vehicles and paved roads, gives you a sense of the immensity of the landscape. You can drive for hours seeing nothing but desert, the horizon always retreating before you, the mountains visible in the distance, but never seeming to get closer. And then, almost suddenly, you see green on the horizon, the unmistakable color of vegetation that signals water, signals life, signals an oasis. The psychological relief is palpable, even when you know you're in no real danger, and you begin to understand what it must have meant to ancient travelers to see that same green after days or weeks in the desert. The smaller oases, the ones that served more as waypoints than as major centers, have their own character. Kuka, for instance, on the northern rim of the Taklamakan, was once an important Buddhist center, home to the monk and translator Kumarajiva, who was instrumental in bringing Buddhist texts to China in the 4th and 5th centuries. The ruins of ancient Kuka, known as Subashi, spread across a large area, including Buddhist temples and monasteries, defensive walls and residential areas all slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Khotan, on the southern route, was famous in ancient times for jade, for silk production. Legend says the techniques of silk production were smuggled out of China, hidden in the headdress of a Chinese princess, marrying into Khotan's royal family. And for its Buddhist culture, the ruins of ancient Khotan cities dot the landscape around the modern town, and the local museum holds remarkable artifacts, beautifully carved wooden architectural elements, wall paintings showing scenes of daily life and religious devotion, manuscripts in Khotanese, an Iranian language now extinct. Yarkand, also on the southern route, served as a crucial trading hub, a place where routes from Kashmir and Ladakh to the south met the main Silk Road. The city had a reputation for its bazaars, its workshops producing carpets and silk, its madrasas and mosques. The old town retained some of its traditional architecture, though much has been lost to modernization. Each of these oases has its own character, its own particular blend of influences and traditions, but they all share certain features: the centrality of water, the agricultural base that supports the population, the role as a node in larger trading networks, the mixing of different peoples and cultures, the coexistence, not always peaceful, of different religious traditions. The rhythm of life in these smaller oases follows patterns established over generations. Dawn comes early, and with it, the first call to prayer for Muslim communities. The sound drifting across fields and orchards as the sky lightens from black to deep blue to the pale gold of sunrise. Farmers are already in their fields by this time, working while the air is still cool, tending to irrigation channels, checking on crops, harvesting vegetables that will be sold in the market later that morning. Water management in these oases is a complex social undertaking, requiring cooperation and careful organization. The systems vary from place to place, but the principles are similar. Water from springs or rivers or underground channels is distributed according to established rites and schedules, with each farmer knowing exactly when their turn comes to direct water onto their fields. In Khotan, for instance, the water distribution is managed by a traditional system called mirabs, water masters who know every inch of the irrigation network, who can resolve disputes and ensure fair distribution. The position is often hereditary, passed from father to son, along with the knowledge and authority it requires. The crops grown in these oases reflect both local conditions and market demands. Wheat and barley are staples, providing the flour for the endless varieties of bread that are central to the local diet. Rice grows in some areas, particularly where water is more plentiful. Cotton has become increasingly important in recent centuries, a cash crop that ties these oases into global markets. But it's the specialty crops that really distinguish each oasis. The jade green grapes of Turpan, the sweet melons of Hami, the apricots of Kuka, the mulberries that feed silkworms in places where silk production continues. The orchards are particularly lovely in spring, when the fruit trees bloom. Apricots flower first, their pale pink blossoms covering the branches like snow. Then come the peaches and plums, the apples and pears. For a few weeks, the oases are transformed into gardens, the air heavy with the scent of blossoms, the sound of bees constant as they move from flower to flower. Walking through a blooming orchard in the morning light, with the mountains visible in the distance and the sound of water running through irrigation channels, you understand why so many poets have written about these oases as earthly paradises, as glimpses of what heaven might be. The animals of the oases are as much a part of the community as the people. Donkeys are everywhere, patient and hard-working, carrying loads through narrow streets, turning water wheels, providing transport for those who can't afford motorized vehicles. The distinctive braying of donkeys is part of the soundscape of these places, as familiar as the call to prayer or the rumble of trucks on the highway. Goats and sheep are kept for milk and meat and wool, grazing on the margins of the oases where cultivation isn't practical. Chickens scratching courtyards, and you often see ducks and geese near irrigation channels, taking advantage of the water. Camels, though less common than they once were, still have their place. The Bactrian camel, with its 2 humps and thick winter coat, is perfectly adapted to the extreme temperature ranges of Central Asia. During the winter months, these camels can survive on very little food and no water, drawing on the fat stored in their humps. In spring and summer, when fresh vegetation is available, they put on weight again, rebuilding their reserves for the next winter. The sight of a camel caravan is increasingly rare, replaced by trucks and railways. But in more remote areas, camels still serve as pack animals, capable of carrying heavy loads across terrain where vehicles can't go. The night sky in these oases is spectacular, especially when you get away from the towns and their electric lights. The air is so clear and dry that stars seem to multiply, filling the sky from horizon to horizon. The Milky Way is a river of light arching overhead, and you can see satellites moving slowly across the sky, modern additions to a scene that would have been familiar to travelers 1,000 years ago. The constellations look different here, or rather, they look the same but more vivid, more distinct, and it's easy to understand why astronomy flourished in Central Asia, why the great observatories were built here, why scholars like Ulugh Beg in Samarkand could make such precise measurements of celestial movements. The seasons in the oases are distinct, each bringing its own character and challenges. Spring is brief but glorious, the moment when winter's grip loosens and the world bursts into life. The trees leaf out, wildflowers bloom in the fields and along roadsides. The first vegetables appear in the markets. But spring also brings dust storms, when wind picks up particles of soil and carries them for miles, reducing visibility and coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Summer is the season of extremes, of heat that builds day after day, of intense sunlight that requires constant adaptation. People adjust their schedules, rising early to work while it's cool, resting during the hottest part of the afternoon, coming out again in the evening when temperatures drop. Buildings are designed for this climate, with thick walls that absorb heat slowly, with courtyards that create microclimates, with roof terraces where you can sleep on hot nights when indoor spaces become unbearable. Autumn is perhaps the most pleasant season, when temperatures moderate and the harvest comes in. The orchards are heavy with ripe fruit. The grape arbors are loaded with bunches ready for picking and drying. The fields are golden with grain ready to be cut. The markets overflow with produce, and there's a sense of abundance, of satisfaction, of the year's work coming to fruition. The light in autumn has a particular quality, golden and warm, and the air begins to carry the first hints of the winter to come. Winter in the oases can be harsh, though it varies by location and elevation. The higher oases, closer to the mountains, see more snow and colder temperatures. The lower oases might go weeks or months with only occasional dustings of snow, but the cold is still real, with temperatures dropping below freezing at night. The canals and channels freeze over. Trees stand bare against the sky, and the landscape takes on a stark beauty. This is the quiet season, when less work happens in the fields, when people spend more time indoors, when the rhythm of life slows. The social life of the oases centers around specific gathering places and events. Tea houses, chaikanas serve as informal community centers, places where men especially gather to drink tea, to talk, to play games. The atmosphere in a chaikliana is relaxed, unhurried, with people dropping in and out throughout the day. The tea is served in small bowls or cups, continuously refilled from large kettles kept hot on charcoal stoves. There might be card games happening at one table, dominoes at another, while at a third, older men engage in conversation, discussing everything from local politics to agricultural techniques to theology. Women have their own gathering spaces, often in homes rather than public venues, though this varies by culture and location. The tradition of hospitality runs deep in these communities, and it's common for neighbors to drop by unannounced, to share tea and conversation, to help with tasks that benefit from many hands. Weddings and other celebrations bring the whole community together, with events that can last for days, involving elaborate meals, music and dancing, the exchange of gifts, the performance of rituals that mark transitions and reinforce social bonds. Living heritage, culture, and tradition. One of the most striking things about the Silk Road oases is how much of the past is still present, still living in contemporary culture. This isn't a dead history, something to be studied only in museums and archaeological sites. It's a living tradition, evolving certainly, adapted to modern realities, but maintaining threads of continuity that reach back centuries. The music of the region is one clear example. The modal systems, the maqams, that structure Central Asian classical music have roots reaching back at least to medieval times, possibly much earlier. The instruments are traditional. The dutar with its 2 strings, the tambour with its long neck and deep resonant sound, the gijak, a spiked fiddle played with a bow, the daf frame drum. The melodies are complex, using quarter tones and microtonal inflections that sound strange to ears trained on Western music, but which have their own sophisticated logic and beauty. The 12 muqam, the great suite of Uyghur classical music, is an extraordinary achievement, comparable in scope and complexity to European classical traditions. It takes hours to perform in its entirety, with each muqam comprising multiple movements that showcase different moods, different rhythms, different aspects of the musical tradition. The lyrics, when there are lyrics, draw on classical poetry, on Sufi mystical texts, on folk wisdom. Learning to perform the 12 muqam takes years of dedicated study, and there are families where the knowledge has been passed down for generations, father to son, mother to daughter, maintaining the tradition across centuries. Dance traditions are equally rich. The Uyghur dance tradition features distinctive neck and wrist movements, quick, intricate footwork, expressive use of the eyes and facial expressions. The dancers often hold small plates or scarves, using them to accentuate movements, to create flowing lines and shapes. The dances range from solemn and meditative to energetic and celebratory, each one telling a story or expressing a particular emotion or celebrating a particular aspect of life. The textile traditions of the region are legendary. Ikat, the resist dye technique where threads are dyed before weaving to create patterns, produces fabrics of breathtaking beauty with slightly blurred edges to the patterns that give them a distinctive soft quality. The best ikat comes from Margilan in the Fergana Valley, where silk production and textile arts have been practiced for more than 2,000 years. The weavers work on ancient looms, using techniques that haven't changed fundamentally in centuries, though the dyes are now mostly chemical rather than natural. Carpet making remains a vital art form, with different regions having distinctive styles. The carpets from Khotan tend toward geometric patterns in reds and blues. Those from Kashgar often incorporate more naturalistic floral motifs. The Turkmen carpets have their distinctive gold patterns, medallions arranged in rows across the field of the carpet. The knots are tied by hand, thousands and thousands of them, creating dense, durable fabrics that can last for generations. The best carpet makers can work at extraordinary speeds, their fingers moving in a blur, yet each knot perfectly placed, each color precisely where it should be. The culinary traditions likewise carry echoes of the Silk Road. The use of cumin and black pepper, of coriander and dried chili, speaks to the spice trade that was so central to the Silk Road economy. The techniques of hand-pulling noodles came from China, but have been adapted and localized. The tradition of pilaf, of rice cooked with meat and vegetables, is essentially the same from Uzbekistan to Xinjiang. Though every region, every city, every family has their own variation, their own secret technique for making it just right. Tea culture is another living heritage. The tea comes from China, of course, but the way it's drunk is distinctly Central Asian. Green tea, often brewed with milk or butter, sometimes with salt. Black tea in ornate teapots, poured into small handleless cups, drunk very hot and very sweet. The ritual of tea drinking as social lubricant, the way business is conducted over tea, the way guests are welcomed with tea, the way conflicts are resolved over tea, all of this carries centuries of cultural weight. The marketplaces, the bazaars, maintain their role as social centers despite the rise of modern shopping malls and online commerce. Going to the bazaar isn't just about buying goods. It's about seeing people, exchanging news, maintaining social connections. The relationships between vendors and regular customers can span decades based on trust and mutual respect. The bargaining isn't just about getting the best price. It's a form of social interaction, a game both sides understand and enjoy. Religious practices continue to shape daily life. The 5 daily prayers of Islam structure the day for many people. The fast of Ramadan is widely observed, with the rhythm of the month fundamentally different from the rest of the year. Meals eaten before dawn and after sunset, the night spent in prayer and socializing. The festivals, Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan and Eid al-Adha during the pilgrimage season, are times of celebration and community, when families gather, when special foods are prepared, when everyone puts on their best clothes. But there's also continuity in the ongoing tensions and challenges these communities face. The question of how to maintain cultural identity while participating in globalized modernity is not new. It's a question these communities have been grappling with for centuries, as empires rose and fell, as trade routes shifted, as new technologies and ideas arrived from elsewhere. The specific challenges change, but the underlying question remains constant. Reflections at Journey's End. Standing in one of these oases, perhaps watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose, you feel the weight of all this history. You think about the countless travelers who stood in these same places, watching the same mountains, feeling the same relief at finding water and shelter after days in the desert. You think about the merchants calculating profits and losses, about the monks carrying sacred texts, about the diplomats bearing messages between courts, about the soldiers guarding caravans, about the farmers tending fields, about the artisans creating beautiful things, about the poets composing verses, about the musicians playing late into the night. The oases of the Silk Road aren't lost, not really. They're here, they continue, they evolve. Some have become major cities, others remain small towns or villages. Some exist only as ruins, but they all tell the same essential story, that human beings, through ingenuity and cooperation, through adaptation and resilience, can create communities even in the most challenging environments. That the desire to connect, to trade, to learn from one another, to share ideas and goods and stories is fundamental to who we are as a species. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Silk Road oases. The thing that makes them more than just historical curiosities. They remind us that cultural exchange, that cosmopolitanism, that the mixing of peoples and ideas isn't some modern phenomenon, but something that has been happening for as long as humans have been traveling. That difference isn't something to fear, but something that enriches us, that brings new flavors and new sounds and new ways of thinking and being. As I prepare to leave these remarkable places, as the journey that began in Dunhuang ends wherever you are, I find myself grateful for the experience, for the privilege of walking in the footsteps of so many who came before, for the chance to witness how the past continues to live in the present. These oases aren't museum pieces. They're living communities, facing modern challenges while maintaining links to their remarkable past. And so we close our journey through the lost oases of the Silk Road. If you've enjoyed exploring these ancient places with me, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel and perhaps liking this episode. There are so many more journeys to take, so many more stories to tell, and I'd be honored to have you along for them. Thank you for listening. May your own travels, whether physical or imagined, bring you safe to comfortable rest. Sleep well.